Welcome back to another Service Management Leadership Podcast. I have a great series, hopefully, for you all today, bringing back good friend David Cannon. David, welcome.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good to be back with you.
So I hit up David, just so everybody knows, because he and I have these ongoing conversations that we think are foundational. I don't want to project this onto David. I don't think we talk enough about the basics, the foundational stuff enough in our industry. We talk about what's great and cool and leading edge and just the basics. I think those conversations are missing. Is that your thought, David?
Yeah, absolutely. It's my thought. It's really fun to talk about the leading edge stuff and where digital technology is going and digital transformation programs, this, that, and the other thing. But time and time again, we find that those are getting tripped up because some of the basic foundational pieces have not been built. So, yeah, I keep finding myself getting brought back to answering how do we deal with some of the basic disciplines and building blocks of service management so that we can then get those taken care of, put them in place, and then move on to some of the higher value, leading edge kind of stuff.
So my image, David, I think in images. I think the leading edge is like we want to build a tall building. We want to build the tallest building in whatever city, but we have to have the foundation well to support the weight and all the stress of that tall building. Is that a good analogy for what we're thinking?
Yeah, very good analogy. You can't go in and build you can get away with certain shortcuts when you're building a single story for 4-room square house. But when you're building a multi-story building that is going to have to last for decades, you can't take those shortcuts. You're not going to get away with it.
Right.
So absolutely right. I think it's a good analogy.
And you're building it for something that you can't even see what tomorrow is going to bring. That's the best part about it. So for the audience, we'll have a series of fairly short podcasts on different basic foundational service management topics. So the lead off one for you, David, is what are 5 things every ITSM program, or you could think individual practice, needs?
Difficult to boil it down to just 5 things, but I'll give it a go. And these purely my opinion of what I think the most important 5 things are for every ITSM program, no matter what the scope is. This is service management. So I think for me, the very first thing is know what your services are. If you don't know what the services are that you provide, it's very difficult to manage them properly. This sounds very easy, but actually there's a lot of different understandings and interpretation of what we mean by services. So if you left it up to an organization to define services and you gave each department head the job of defining the services that their department provides, you will end up with a service catalog that runs into probably hundreds of services, most of which are not actually services at all. For example, if you want us to help you evaluate a change, request this service. Well, that's not a service at all. That's really part of the change management process, and it's part of your job to assist in assessing certain types of change. So you've all got to be very clear across the organization and consistent about what the services are that you as an organization support. That's the first thing. The second thing is you really have to understand the context in which you're providing those services. So what is it that your business does, what your organization does? What business are you in? How does that business work? How do the different units within your organization, how do they operate? What do they need to be successful? What is most valuable to them? What things are most important to them? And if we understand those things, then it's a lot easier for us to do things like prioritizing our activity and, for example, how we respond to incidents, how we plan for service continuity, and so on. Very difficult to do anything that involves prioritization if we don't know what is going on within the organization that we're part of. Then the third thing is, oh, and I'm sorry, before we get onto the third thing, it's kind of related to the third thing, but it's understanding what happens when you deliver your services. It's one thing to be able to say, well, I know what my services are and I know who uses them, but what actually happens when they get used? Invariably, the thing that happens when services get used is not a digital thing. It's actually a physical activity, or it's a physical product that gets delivered or used. And if we lose track of that connection, that physical activity that takes place within the business unit, it's very, very difficult for us to be able to provide the right level of service. So it's not just about understanding what services we deliver and who uses them. It's also about what people do with those services when they use them. And then that leads into the third thing, which is the ability to map your services. You can't just assume that because you know how different technologies or tools or devices or applications connect to each other, that you automatically understand what the value of those services is, or how they're being used and how important they are to the organization that uses them. The other thing about mapping services is that very often you'll find those further links in the chain. This is something that is very important. It's something that a lot of IT organizations in the past have kind of stopped too early in defining the service. So what we'll do is we'll say, well, what do you need from us, business unit? And the business unit will tell us, well, we need this service, so we need it to work like this. And we say, cool, we can do that for you. We deliver the service. But what we don't realize is that that service then gets reworked into something else that gets delivered to somebody else. And that somebody else takes that service and reworks it into something else that gets delivered to something else. And all we're looking at is that one single link in the chain. I'm delivering this service to that business unit. I don't really care what happens to it afterwards. What we're finding out, though, is that being able to support services effectively means understanding what happens in the next link of the chain. For example, we want to prioritize incidents, and we have to understand the impact of those incidents. So just how important is it that we respond quickly? And we say, well, you know, it's not really impacting anybody at this stage. Something broke, but it's not really impacting. Don't worry about it. We'll get to it at some point. And suddenly it impacts some business unit, and then suddenly we're trying to react, and we're late because we knew about it 2 days ago, but we didn't do anything, and now it's really broken, and we're now having to recover. That's very difficult. We think that only happens internal to IT, but what about other business units who are using IT services, and that service breaks? And it's not that important to them at that time, but if it's left broken for another 3 days, it's going to become really important. So the other units involved in that chain, they face the same kind of prioritization questions that we do. They face the same kind of impact assessments that we do when their services break. We're not the only ones who provide services. So if we understand how our services connect to other services and products in the organization, it becomes a lot more effective and a lot easier to prioritize work and to know exactly what action to take. So mapping services is very important, and don't just stop where that service gets handed over from the IT department, because it's more likely part of a whole value chain. So that means not only mapping services, but mapping value streams or value chains. And when we talk about mapping, it's very important to focus on two aspects of mapping. A lot of people just focus on the architecture aspect. So if I can draw a picture of all of the different components that are used to deliver a service, that's service mapping. But there's another component as well in the map, and that is, how is that service used? So for example, we have a service, it's up and running and it's available, but nobody uses it. And then on the 25th of the month, it goes down. Well, that's okay. It's actually been pretty good up until the 25th. It was 100% available. What we don't realize is that on the 25th of the month, suddenly there is an activity that happens every month on the 25th, and that service becomes absolutely critical. For the other for the previous 24 days, didn't matter. You have to be able to know those kind of variables, and you don't get that information by just looking at the architecture of the service. You really have to look at how the service is used. We call that in ITIL version 3, we call that a service model. So it's the architecture and the model, how the service is used. So when we talk about mapping service, it's both of those. So we're on to point number 3. So first of all, know what your services are. Second, learn as much as you can about the business of your organization. Third, map your services. And the fourth point, I think, which is relevant to what we're doing today, is understanding that the role of IT is changing. If you look at ITIL version 1, 2, and even version 3, the model of IT management and IT governance was very much IT as a service provider, and it provides services to customers, most of which are internal to the organization. Well, along comes cloud, and suddenly we have a lot of those business units that are acquiring IT services or digital technologies directly from a cloud service provider or other type of vendor. And suddenly IT is just one of many service providers. Do we just stay in the role of IT service provider? Because if we do that, then our role in the organization is going to continue to shrink. And not only is it going to continue to shrink, but we're going to be moved further and further and further back into the technology management of the devices that we are left in control of. And these will be things like network switches and so on. So it's really important if we want to continue to play a more strategic role in our organization, we have to expand from being just a service provider to also becoming something like a service broker or a trusted advisor or a strategic component of the organization. Digital technology will change the way in which IT works within an organization. And the ITSM program really needs to adjust to that. And we'll talk about that in one of the follow-up podcasts to this one. So I'll leave that for now. But I will also say, as part of that, is the roles that we are used to performing today will change. For example, we're very used to, as IT, being in control of the technology that we manage. We specify to the nth degree exactly what that technology should look like, how it should perform, what its architecture should be, and so on and so forth. But when we move those services into the cloud, we don't have that level of control over the devices anymore. We're now using services. When in effect, we've become customers. We have become the kind of customer that our users used to be. And we need to learn how to play that role. We need to learn how to become effective customers, in addition to being effective service providers, in addition to being effective service brokers, in addition to being effective service integrators. So there are a bunch of new roles that are starting to emerge and evolve, and I think we should be really thinking very seriously about those if we want our ITSM program to continue to play a central role in our organization. And then the final point, and we've really touched on this, and that is just learn the basics. Do not take shortcuts, because they will come around and they will bite you. The one shortcut that we love to take is to use a tool to do something that we haven't yet perfected ourselves. We're going to talk about configuration management, I believe, on one of our follow-up podcasts. And one of the favorite things we do is we say, look, this whole configuration management thing, it is so complicated. And it's got so much technology involved. Fortunately, there are tools that do this discovery. We don't have to worry about defining the classes of CI and so on and so forth. No, that's absolutely wrong. You even more need to focus on defining your level of CI control and so on when you're using a tool. So don't, I think the final point here is learn the basics and make sure that everybody in your organization knows the basics. And there's a kind of side point to that. And that is, please don't confuse an ITIL Foundation course with the basics. The ITIL Foundation course is really just an orientation. It doesn't teach you the basic disciplines of how to manage IT. It just gives you an orientation around the major structures and how they all fit together, but it doesn't actually teach you the basics. If you want to learn the basics, you'll need to go a lot further. And it's not just ITIL. There are a number of other guidelines and frameworks and technologies, depending on what kind of technology you're using, where you will need to source those basics. But do not take shortcuts when it comes to the basics. So those are the 5.
So I wanted to summarize. There's a couple points in there and so I appreciate your guidance. That was great. So the first one is, we in IT are both a service provider and a consumer. And you mentioned the cloud example. And we have to, when we are the consumer, we're the consumer on the behalf of someone else. So we move from an operations hat to more of a, how do we do things well? So it may be a business hat, it might be something else hat, because we're consuming it to provide it to someone else.
That's right.
That part really struck me. And then the other one was, when we talk about mapping services, and I think of the who, what, when, how, why, all of that stuff. A lot of what you spoke on is trying to understand the why, because the why will determine our scope, our granularity. Where do we put our resources? The why really seems to stick out to me. Is that a fair thing?
It's very fair on both of those points. I think the why is something that's very often missing. Because we've been used to being service providers, we don't have to ask why.
Right.
We just have to ask what. What is it you need me to do? And how much is it going to cost, so that I make sure I have the budget and the resources to be able to do it? You answer the why, I'll answer the how. And that's not the case anymore. We really are getting involved in the front lines of the business, where the why is exceptionally important. I mean, it always was important. We always needed to understand it, but we could kind of get away if we didn't fully understand it, as long as we did what we were asked to do. That's not the case anymore. We just really have to understand that. And on your first point about being a consumer and a service provider, inside an organization, nobody is a pure consumer.
Right.
Everybody in the organization is supporting somebody else with the aim that that person is going to be able to provide a service to somebody else. At some point, we're going to provide it to an external consumer who, as far as we're concerned, is the end of the chain. But inside an organization, we always wear 2 hats. We're a consumer and we're a provider. Every single person, without exception, in the organization plays those 2 roles.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because it's a change of paradigm for most of us. Somebody's a database administrator. They've always been a service provider, but they're also consuming network. They're consuming something. Right. And so they have to have that mindset of, how am I consuming it? How can I efficiently consume it so I can efficiently provide it? Because we have finite resources. I mean, that's a fact.
Right. And as a result of that kind of thinking, some early ITSM programs were restricted to services that were provided inside IT. So when we talk about change management and incident management, we only ever talk, well, not so much incident management, but certainly change management. We looked at how you manage changes inside IT. We didn't really think about the changes that were happening outside of IT. And we talked about services as the services offered between networks, or let's say server hosting and application or database administration, for example. But in reality, those have to be taken further. Have to understand the full value stream that they're involved in. You can't just stop between the server administrators and the database administrators and say, well, now we've defined the services, because what does the database administrator do? And they support an application. What does that application do? That supports business activity. What does that business activity do? It supports, and so you keep going. So it's really important to be able to do that, and especially in a world of digital technology, where a lot of the links in the chain are being supported by technology. It's not just, I'm the service provider, there is one link to you, you use the technology. No, I'm using technology to do that. Then you use a different technology to go from there to there. And then they use a different technology to go from there to there. Who's in control of that end-to-end amalgamation of all this technology that's being used?
Right. And it's the question every organization has to answer. David, thank you for sharing your wisdom on this part one. And audience, we'll see you next time as we talk about improving or initiating a service management program. Hopefully this has been great. I enjoy talking about the basics. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Bye.